Education cannot evolve without asking and structurally including the most important resource, students themselves. What is needed to make sustainable developments in education that will provide students with the 21st century the skills needed to become successful, happy, and active world citizens? Well, our next speaker will tell us that in her keynote address. It is my pleasure to introduce to the stage Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentien of the Netherlands, who will speak on co-creating the educational system, the power of shared learning. After we hear from Her Royal Highness, Mr. Tom Blackwell, CEO of EM, will have a short fireside chat with her. Please join me in welcoming Her Royal Highness Princess Laurentien.
Good morning, everyone, and what a night we had. And I'd like to thank Dr. Charles Chen for this amazing evening. And I'd like to thank as well the two laureates from last night, from this year's prize, Dr. Larry Hedges and Professor Larry Hedges and Professor Agarwal. And I'd also like to thank you for keeping me up all night. Because after yesterday, I threw away my speech and rewrote my new speech. And this is, I guess, what the inspiration that you bring do to me. And there are three quotes that I'd like to use as the common thread throughout my speech. The first is a remark by Carrie Lam, the chief executive, and she said, "What we're still finding out is how best to nurture young minds." And Professor Agarwal, you mentioned last night that your amazing platform is about all learners choosing when, where, how, and where they learn. And Professor Hedges, I was particularly taken by your call to action that we need to close the gap between practitioners and scientists. Now, what these comments have in common is that we're all looking and not assuming that we know what people want to learn and what people feel inside when they are learning. So I'd like to focus on the child, a slightly younger age that we heard about last night. And I'd like you to look around your table. I see that there are not many empty seats. But I would like you to imagine throughout today, and today, this morning, who is sitting in the empty seat? Where is the child? We'll be looking at the child. And it's taken from my work. I work mainly with children between 8 and 12. And I stand with one leg in the world of children and one leg in the world of adults, and translating in a way between them. And I'll be sharing some thoughts about that. Now, what I mean, I'd like to start with a story, a real-life story, from somebody who did indeed take together practice and science. And it's the story of Janusz Korczak, the Polish Jewish educator who was born in 1878. And he discovered the power of children through a journey of his own discovering and being humbled as he went along by the power of children. He said that the further he advanced, the less he knew. I feel indeed the same. He was at a time when corporal punishment was still very much the normal thing to do. He was astonished and wondered why we feel it is wrong for men and adults to slap each other and to use violence. Well, it was perfectly okay to do that against children. He ran an orphanage in Poland with 192 orphans, and there were only a dozen adults running it. They had their own parliament, they had their own court, and they had their own rules, and it was perfectly wonderfully run. And yesterday I was listening to your story, Professor Agarwal, when you mentioned the slap on the knuckles and how that completely demotivated you. Now, the sadness of the story is that Janusz Korczak, when the children were taken away by the Nazis in 1942, he was given a way out, but he refused. And he actually went to Treblinka extermination camp together with the children. And this is how far he went in seeing them as equal citizens and not just as minor individuals. Now, there's a particular quote that I'd like to use for today. And he said, "Children are not the people of tomorrow, but they are the people of today. They have the right to be taken seriously and to be treated with tenderness and respect. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they are meant to be. The unknown person inside of them is our hope for the future." Now, what does this mean? We actually, I see that perhaps some of you as educators, you listen and you think, aha, this is the word motivation. And motivation is indeed the key, but motivation is in a way an extrapolation of this unknown person inside that we don't know. And there's only one way to find out, is to actually speak to them. And what I'd like to share with you is how we as adults, we are constantly assuming that we know, and perhaps that the more we think we know, the more we assume of understanding this person inside. Now, OECD is actually very clear about the importance of motivation. It says it takes engagement and motivation to learn. It says that it plays a central role not only for academic achievement, but also to enable students to live their full lives. And they've had two very interesting policy recommendations in the last PISA results. One is to build better teacher-student relations in order to strengthen students' feelings of belonging at school. It's about feelings. Learning is not just about something external, but it's something inside. And they actually are saying that we should build innovative pedagogies on the natural learning inclinations of students to play, to express themselves, to collaborate, and to create. And we should wonder whether our educational systems are actually built on those natural inclinations. Who is that unknown person inside? And again, we should never be so arrogant in a way to assume that we know. So on this wonderful Monday morning, I'd like you to go to that place and to close your eyes for just a moment while you go back to that 8-year-old inside. Whether you have a child or your surroundings, but more importantly even for you as educators to go to that place again when you were 8 years old. So close your eyes and imagine. Imagine you're 8 years old and you wake up. You're tired. You're being shouted at. Hurry up, get your stuff, go to school. If you're lucky, you get breakfast. And if not, you have to hurry and get to school. You enter school, you're being rushed in, and nobody is looking at you. You sit down, your teacher starts talking, doesn't say why you're learning what you learn. You doze off, you're bored, or start bothering your other students. You get punished, you get shouted at, and after school you stay to do some stupid writings 100 times over. Maybe at best you're thinking about building a space shuttle or about planting trees. But there you're sitting, being punished and being shouted at. Now think for just 1 second how you feel. And when you've done that, think of school and how it is. And that in a way it's a mismatch between what you feel as a child and how you see yourself, and how the adult sees you and thinks that he or she sees you and sees how you learn. No one sees you. You feel misunderstood, let alone having a chance to express what you think. You feel undervalued and underestimated. It's a mismatch between, on the one hand, the way the child sees itself and the way that we're developing our systems. And it's a stifling of motivation, of talent, and potential. Now, if we see the child behaving that he or she does, we will be measuring motivation in completely the wrong way. We've never seen that there was a deep motivation inside, but the system just wasn't able to bring it out. And perhaps then we end up with completely the wrong figures of motivation. And time again, I wonder if we're actually asking the right questions to the unknown person inside. Now, how to address this mismatch? It's about adults. Adults to be learners again, and to understand that learning is about shared learning. That adults are parents and teachers and educators. Raising a child and educating a child is a process of shared learning. That it's the adults who should dare to learn to listen again, to ask open questions, to listen in between the lines of what children are actually saying, and to put yourself in the shoes of the others. And that we adults should learn to let go of thinking we have all the answers. How liberating is that? Now, adults and children are not equal, thankfully, because otherwise there would be no hope for the future if we only had adults in this world. And I think that's the magic, that we're not equals, but we're treated as equals. That adults know things that children don't know, and that children know things that adults don't know. And the hardest of all is perhaps to have an honest look at ourselves as adults. Are we still curious enough? Are educators around the world, teachers, still curious enough? I think children outsmart us. Do we take the time to actually understand and look out for the other? Are we still able to be humbled by having a small person tell us different things that we haven't thought of? I believe that the role of the educator is to capture the natural curiosity of a child, but can only do so if he or she himself is actually curious, him or herself. Now, if you think I'm completely crazy, which I can understand, this is what people felt about 10 years ago when I founded the Missing Chapter Foundation in the Netherlands. And it was never intended as a start as a child initiative, but it was fed by the inability of adults, decision makers, to be taking the right decision when it comes to climate change. And I strongly felt ahead of the Copenhagen summit that adults need help. And I kept on thinking, they need help because we need to ask the better questions. And we're assuming a lot of things. And then after a year and a half of research, I felt there's only one group that can help adults, and that's children, just because they ask the why. And 10 years on, we've created over 100 companies have now a children's council, a board of children. The government has a children's council. Municipalities have a children's council. And we've developed a methodology of equal dialogue. And so for 10 years, I've been able to see how the world is divided in adults who do have the ability to be humbled by the power of children and the adults who don't. And usually, they give themselves away by people not writing anything down when children speak. And not writing things down is a sign that you think you have it all in your head. And yet we're asking children to always write down what adults are saying. So the next step, and I have countless examples of where children's thinking is so different you will be absolutely amazed and in awe about the power of children to take us by the hand to come up with new thinking. Now, the next step, of course, is to apply this much more broadly in education. And this is why last night I was so taken by the two professors, where I thought I have so much to learn from them, and perhaps they can take this thinking into a much broader scale. Now, what it takes for education. First of all, I think we have to take children seriously, to the very heart of education. And actually that we start co-designing, not just curricula with children, but entire way we develop our learning and school ecosystems. From start to finish, I bet you that children have an amazing ability to actually say, how are we spending our money best? And yet we're separating the content and the budgetary approaches in our school systems. They can develop the rules of engagement together in a school. Now, how do we do that? It's the educators who need to be trained. We need to be stripping ourselves of the assumptions. We need to strip ourselves from the top-down approach. In a way, edX is already doing that. And we need to understand how to speak and ask the right questions and engage with children and listen to what they have to say. Standing in the world of children and adults is something absolutely extraordinary and has changed my life. They have taught me that there can be no light between what you think, what you do, what you say, and what you believe, because they will just see immediately and right through. They are my immediate sanity check every day, to see if I'm still true or whether I'm just living in a bubble. And children might see a princess at the beginning, but after about 10 seconds, that goes away. And you can see it in their eyes when they trust you or not trust you. So what does this mean? I hope you'll be thinking about that empty chair all day long, and when you go away, back to your amazing places of work. I no longer see the world in the same way. And in fact, I use this kind of methodology in all kinds of discussions, but also it's about the human designed solutions, be it with a child or with any people who are not living in our bubbles. Innovation in education for me is unraveling the unknown person inside, and thus have a deeper understanding of the feeling of the learner. And a learner is just not a learner, it's a human being. It happens to be a small child or anyone, but it's about a human being who lives in a certain context, and we have to understand that context in order to make sure that the education we provide is actually matching that context. I would like to call on all educators to never forget the child inside. Not the child that you are trying to educate, nor the child inside of yourself. Both use people as the inner motivation, Professor Agarwal and Professor Larry Hedges, that people themselves need to help define the problem. Because if we don't define the problem in the right way, we will measure the wrong thing. And if we measure the wrong thing, we will do the wrong thing. I'd like to end with a quote, actually two quotes of a number of younger individuals that I unraveled the notions of leadership with and of innovation. And it was a group of 10-year-olds that we started to look at some of these difficult concepts. And one child said, and he's 10 years old, he said, what is leadership? Leadership, he said, ultimately, is about learning to let go of thinking that you always have to be the best. Because, this child said, you can never always be the best. So you have to let go of that notion and practice of not thinking that you always have to be the best. And imagine the freedom and the relaxation that it provides. And then when we talked about innovation, and I think this entire summit is about innovation, he said, innovation is not sharing what you know. Innovation is sharing what you don't know. Let that be our drive for today, and ending with the quote we just heard from Dr. Charles Chen, that we should learn from each other and act together, and never forget the child inside. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for some extremely important and also challenging remarks and challenging ideas. And I'll tell you where I'm coming from here, in that one of the particularly acute, I think, gaps in knowledge or gaps in perspective when we're talking about listening to children, listening to the younger generation, with which I absolutely agree. I have a 4-year-old daughter. When she was 2, she figured out how to order Kindle books. And when she was 3, she placed her first Amazon Prime order without my involvement. The question I have is, when you bring these generations together, when technology is, in fact, it's moving at such pace for the young generation, and the older generation, I don't believe, is keeping up with that at all. How do they find a common language? And will finding that common language become increasingly difficult as technology continues to shoot forward?
Well, in the end, technology is only a means to an end. And I think that this is one of the very specific ways and places where the adults have to apply this definition I just shared about leadership. And it's learning to let go that they're not the best. And so this is a perfect place where children can teach adults, and adults can teach and actually can learn, and children can teach the adults. One of the reasons I believe that technology is not in a broad sense part of education today is because teachers are afraid of it, because they don't understand it as much as children do. But imagine how, on the one hand, you allow children to bring in the technology into learning, but perhaps then the adults to focus their energy on developing ways that they learn empathy or they learn other things. And so the shared learning approach is, I think, very much important in this place to bring in digitalization.
You're a very active speaker on this issue. This is an issue that you're passionate about, and I know you travel around the world and you talk about this. Do you find that, are people receptive to this idea? I mean, do people agree with you? I suspect theoretically they do, but do you find that there is a readiness to take this on, or is this still a challenge to persuade people that this is important? And also, from your world travels, do you see culturally differences in terms, are there regions where people are more receptive or less to this idea?
You're asking if people think I'm crazy. You're quite right. Well, actually, I'll tell you a story to start with the last one. Very importantly, we have, in the Netherlands, we have relationships with Aruba and Curacao, and they have educational systems that are very top-down. And culturally, children are being taught to not speak when the adults, until the adults are inviting them. So very top-down and very stifling in a way. And everybody warned me, said, don't go to Aruba and Curacao, and because it will never happen and it will never work. Well, I said, call me crazy and show me and prove me wrong, but I want to try. And we saw actually that what it did to the children there, that they were perfectly capable to think very freely and very deeply, actually, about the challenges that the companies that had a kids council there put to them. So if we allow children, I think certainly in that age group, culturally, there's no difference. I've had dialogues in China where people say, how can Chinese children actually speak their minds so freely? Well, they do, because they have a lot of insights within them. So culturally, yes. On your first question, I do think that people assume that this is about child participation, and it's the Article 12 in the Convention of the Rights of the Child. It's the least applied right of a child. And I think it is because adults are not trained to listen in between the lines of the magic of children, just because we're so full of ourselves. So I think there's a lot of assumption that we know and we think it's child participation, but that ultimately it's the adult's interpretation of child participation, and not really allowing children to run the show. And because we're so afraid that it might be different than what we had in our minds, or we are so afraid that it might be a little bit more unruly than we have thought, well, let them and trust them that they have that. And again, which is not to say that children are completely ruling the world. I also believe in structure. Children want structure, but then within that, let them more free. And I think it's adults. So on the one hand, people believe now that we have 100 kids councils. They think, wow, that's really amazing. But on the other hand, I still think that there's a long way to go to truly deeply understand what the depth of this means.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and it might be the hardest. I come back to one of the key themes of this summit, which is the how. And I think sometimes one of the risks of these summits is that people get together, very bright, wise people get together with a lot of ideas, and then we leave the building and everyone gets on with their daily lives. How do we take some of these ideas that we're talking about here and really put them into practice going forward?
Two answers to that. One is, I think, to put into practice what this 10-year-old said about innovation, to share what you don't know. So I think by leaving and saying, what did I learn and what is it that I don't know, you will start connecting the way that Dr. Chen said we have to act together. So learn from each other much more structurally, I think, is on the one hand. And the entire approach of child participation that I've been talking about always starts with a help question, with a dilemma, and that the children then allow them in. The second thing is, I think, if you believe in this approach, to listen to the learner, just go away and open up yourselves and say, I don't know, tell me. So go and have that conversation with learners and allow yourself to be inspired by them and apply this and get off a high horse, if anyone is on a high horse, and put yourself in the learning position, I think, is hopefully what people will do after this summit. And I tell you perhaps one last thing about the magic of children and how they really, really think differently. And the example is around poverty. And we have a number of municipalities that installed a kids council helping the mayor and the board on poverty policy. And in the Netherlands, we are giving passes, discount passes, to children who are living in poverty. And we believe, because we as adults, we think poverty is children who don't have things like bicycles in our country or a sports pass. So we give them a discount pass. And when you start unraveling a problem like poverty with children, children will say, it's not just about not having things, it's about feeling powerless, and it's about being bullied, and it's about feeling different and being actually labeled poor. And Professor Hedges told me actually that that was what he was living through when he was growing up. And so this pass, through the eyes of adults, we think we're doing the right thing. We give them a pass, but children are saying, well, that's actually counterproductive because it's stigmatizing me. So then adults are saying, yes, but we still want to do discount things. What do we do? And then the children say, well, give every child a pass and put more money on some passes and not on the others. So just to finish with the magic of children to really give us new ideas.
Mrs. Laurentien, thank you very much indeed for your inspiring remarks. Thank you very much.